In this episode, I'm going to remove the steering column so that I can replace the turn signal switch, remove the bearing housing and the gear shift housing so they can be repainted, and remove the turn signal and the shifter and send them off to get rechromed. So let's get started. First, I disconnected the battery to prevent the horn from blowing while I removed the steering wheel. I removed the center cap, disconnected the horn wire, removed the horn ring, and removed the nut. Now that all of that is out of the way, I used a steering wheel puller to remove the steering wheel. It's going to be a long time before I put the steering wheel back on, so I like to use these right-on bags to keep everything organized. I don't trust my memory, so this helps me out a lot. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to get some of these right-on bags. Next, I remove the panel from below the steering wheel by removing the screws that hold it on. And of course I labeled a bag to hold the screws. I removed the vent cables from the vent by sliding the wire over the top. Then I removed the clips that hold the cables. And I labeled a bag to hold the clips. Underneath the dash, I removed the two nuts that hold the steering column. It's easier to disconnect the steering column from the steering gearbox if the master cylinder and brake booster are out of the way, so I removed them. I used some line wrenches on the brake line fittings to prevent rounding off the fittings. Next, I removed the vacuum line going to the brake booster. Under the dash are 4 nuts holding the brake booster to the firewall. These are not easy to access. I had to use a long extension and a universal joint to remove all the nuts. Finally, I removed the bolt that holds the brake booster to the brake pedal. Removing the brake booster makes access to the steering column much easier. Now that I have access, I removed this metal cover. I think this cover is a heat shield so that the rubber bushing doesn't get cooked by the heat from the exhaust manifold. It was held in place by 3 screws. I removed the cotter pins, then applied some penetrating oil to the threads before removing the Allen head bolts. The clip that holds the shift arm to the transmission level was difficult for me to figure out. It's not a cotter pin, instead it's some kind of spring clip. The inspection mirror helped me figure out the best way to remove it. Finally, I put all of the fasteners and clips into a right-on zipper bag. Next, I removed the gear indicator from the steering column. I disconnected the backup light switch connector, then disconnected the turn signal wiring harness. It had some clips on each side that need to be lifted out of the way. It would have been easier if I had 3 hands, but I managed to get it done with 2. I removed the plate that holds the steering column from the firewall by removing the 3 bolts that hold it in place. At last, I was able to remove the steering column. With the steering column on a workbench, I removed the screw from the turn signal switch, then removed the 3 screws from the plate. Next, I removed the turn signal arm so that I could send it off to get replated. I pulled the wires up through the column just enough so that I could get the turn signal switch out of the way. That gave me access to the 4 screws under it. One of the screws gave me a hard time, so I had to use a magnet to get it out. Once again, I labeled a bag to get everything organized. I removed the snap ring from the shaft with some snap ring pliers. With a few taps from a rubber hammer, I was able to remove the bearing housing. Under the shifter housing is an access hole that allows you to remove the Allen head bolt, so I removed that. To remove the shift lever, I took the tension off the spring with a pair of vice grips. I used a light pressure on the vice grips. It was just enough to hold the pin without putting dents in it. I used a roll pin punch and removed the roll pin that holds the shift lever. I'll put a link in the description below for these. They're the exact diameter of the roll pin, and they removed the roll pin without damaging it. Next, I removed the vice grips. I removed the clip that goes from the steering column to the gear indicator and put them in a right-on zipper bag. Next, I removed the 2 screws from the plastic ring at the bottom of the steering column. I removed the backup light switch without a problem and put it in a right-on zipper bag. The tricky part was removing the post from the steering column. You have to squeeze together the clip while prying the washer that keeps it squeezed. It would have been easier if I had 3 hands, but I was able to do it with 2. To remove the clip from the column, I used some lock ring pliers. I'll put a link in the description below for these too. I was finally able to remove the shaft from the column. With the shaft out of the way, this plate came out easily. To remove the shifter housing from the shifter shaft, I lightly tapped the shaft while pulling on the housing until it was flush. To get it off completely, I lightly tapped the housing from the back side until they were separated. The connectors that hold the wire into the harness have 2 little barbs on them. These barbs keep the wires from pulling out. To remove them, I used a terminal extractor tool to push down the barbs while pulling on the wire. I'll leave a link in the description below for the extractor tools that I used. Even with the extractor tool, the job was not easy. It took a lot longer than I thought it would. Once the wires were all removed, I taped the connectors together so they wouldn't snag anything as I pulled the wires through the steering column. The wires came through the shifter housing with no problems, but I had to remove the tape to get it through the bearing housing. That's going to be a wrap for this video. If you enjoyed it, please click that thumbs up button. And if you would like to follow the progress on this restoration, consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell.